The tape arrived at the CBS Records offices in Los Angeles on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1982. It came inside a plain brown envelope, no cover letter, no promotional materials, no glossy press photos. Just a reel of magnetic tape, labeled in Marvin Gaye's own handwriting, sent from a small studio in Ostend, Belgium, a coastal town that most people at the label couldn't have found on a map. Larkin Arnold, the CBS executive who had signed Marvin to the label just months earlier, held the envelope for a moment before handing it to his assistant and asking for a playback setup in the conference room. He had heard stories about Marvin's condition in Europe: the tax debts, the failed marriages, the cocaine, the paranoia. He had taken a calculated risk signing a man who many in the industry had quietly written off as finished. And now the first real result of that gamble was sitting in a plain brown envelope, looking like it had been mailed by someone who didn't particularly care whether anyone listened. The conference room filled slowly. A&R staff, marketing people, a few senior producers who had been briefed that this was something they should hear. Arnold sat at the head of the table, arms folded, face neutral, the particular expression of a man who has learned not to show anticipation before he's heard what he's about to judge. The tape began to roll, and for the first 4 seconds, everyone in that room heard the same thing: a drum machine, a thin mechanical pulse, the kind of beat that was already becoming associated with cheap synthesizer pop, with the disposable club music that serious artists were supposed to be above. Someone near the back of the room made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Arnold didn't move. Then a synthesizer line came in, simple, almost skeletal, hovering over that drum machine like something half-remembered from a dream. And then, after a silence that felt longer than it was, Marvin's voice arrived. Arnold shifted in his seat. He didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. The voice was doing something that the drum machine and the synthesizer had no right to support. Something raw and wide open, something that made the sparse arrangement feel not like a limitation, but like a frame deliberately stripped down to make space for exactly this. The song was called Sexual Healing, and it was unlike anything Marvin Gaye had released before, which was the problem. When the tape ended, Arnold sat for a long moment before speaking. When he did, his words were measured and professional, the kind of directness that powerful men deploy when they want criticism to land as fact rather than opinion. He said the production was beneath Marvin's caliber. He said the drum machine was a liability, that radio programmers would hear that mechanical pulse and make their decision in the first 10 seconds. He said the arrangement sounded like a demo, like the sketch of a song rather than a finished record, and that Marvin Gaye, the Prince of Soul, the architect of what's going on, the man whose voice had defined an entire era of American music, deserved better than a beat made by a machine in a foreign country. He said it with something close to respect, which made it worse. Word reached Marvin in Ostend through a phone call that he took standing at a public payphone on the street, because he no longer trusted the phone in his apartment. He listened without interrupting. His contact in Los Angeles relayed Arnold's concerns carefully, diplomatically, with the practiced softness of someone delivering news they know won't be received well. The drum machine, the sparse production, the sense that the record wasn't finished. When the call ended, Marvin stood for a moment on the cold Belgian street, the North Sea wind coming off the water and cutting through the thin jacket he was wearing. Then he walked back to the studio and asked the engineer to set up another playback of the track. He sat alone in the dark room and listened to Sexual Healing from beginning to end. He didn't take notes. He didn't call anyone. He didn't ask the engineer what he thought. When the song finished, Marvin stood up, straightened his jacket, and said 4 words that the engineer would remember for the rest of his life. It stays exactly this way. Then he went home. What Larkin Arnold and the CBS conference room did not know, what they couldn't have known because Marvin had never told anyone the full story, was what this recording had cost him. He hadn't written Sexual Healing from a position of creative confidence. He had written it from the floor. In early 1981, his life in America had collapsed so completely that escape felt like the only rational response. The IRS was pursuing him for back taxes that ran into the millions. His first marriage to Anna Gordy had ended in a settlement so brutal that Marvin had literally signed over the royalties to an entire album to cover what he owed. His second marriage to Janice Hunter was disintegrating. His cocaine use had reached a point where friends stopped counting the days between coherent conversations and simply waited to see which version of Marvin would answer the phone. He had fled to London, then to Belgium, with very little money and even less certainty that he had anything left to give. The apartment he rented in Ostend overlooked the sea, and there were nights when he would stand at the window for hours, watching the water. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was one of the few things that felt as empty as he did. Sexual healing didn't emerge from inspiration. It emerged from desperation. Marvin needed money, needed to prove to himself that the music was still there, needed a reason to stay in a country that wasn't his, and a life that felt increasingly like it belonged to someone else. He started building the track alone, late at night, with a drum machine and a synthesizer. Not because he was making an artistic statement about electronic music, but because those were the tools available to him in a foreign studio where he couldn't afford a full band. The sparseness of the production was the honest result of circumstances. The vulnerability in his voice was the honest result of everything else. When he sang about needing healing, about desire and connection, and the particular salvation that comes from another human being choosing to stay close to you, he wasn't performing. He was documenting. That's the part that Larkin Arnold heard in the conference room and couldn't categorize. He heard the drum machine and made a professional judgment. He applied the metrics of a music industry that had taught itself to evaluate recordings based on precedent, on what had worked before, on the calculus of radio play and chart position and demographic appeal. And by those metrics, he was making a reasonable argument. A drum machine demo recorded by a reclusive, drug-dependent artist in a small Belgian coastal town did not look like a comeback. It did not look like the next chapter of a legendary career. It looked like a man working with what he had left, which in the language of the music industry translates roughly to not enough. What Arnold could not factor into his assessment, what no A and R calculation could accommodate, was the specific gravity of a voice that has been stripped of everything except the truth. Marvin's vocal on Sexual Healing was the sound of a man who had stopped performing and started confessing, and that distinction is not something that shows up in a production meeting. The record was released in September 1982. Radio programmers received it and made their decisions in the first 10 seconds, exactly as Larkin Arnold had predicted. Except the decision they made was to play it immediately and keep playing it. The drum machine that had concerned the conference room became the most recognizable opening pulse in R&B that year. The spare synthesizer line that sounded like a demo became the architecture of a sound that felt both modern and ancient at once. And Marvin's voice, doing exactly what it had always done when given enough silence to work in, rose through that skeletal arrangement and turned it into something that couldn't be ignored. Sexual Healing entered the Billboard Hot 100 and climbed with a steadiness that confused people who had expected it to plateau. It reached number 3. It stayed on the R&B charts for an extraordinary stretch, eventually logging over 6 months of continuous presence. Radio stations that had initial doubts about the drum machine were now playing the song so frequently that listeners called in to request it by name, even when it was already scheduled. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a room when something undeniable has just occurred. It is not the silence of confusion or the silence of boredom. It is the silence of people who have just encountered something that doesn't fit the shape of their expectations and who need a moment to decide whether to admit it. That silence settled over the CBS offices in Los Angeles when Sexual Healing began accumulating data that no one had projected. Sales figures, radio rotation numbers, listener response metrics, all of it moving in a direction that contradicted the conference room's verdict. Nobody said anything right away. That's how institutions absorb being wrong. Slowly, quietly, with the careful redistribution of enthusiasm that makes it hard to trace who originally doubted what. The Grammy nominations arrived in early 1983, and Marvin won 2 of them: Best Male R&B Vocal Performance and Best R&B Song. He stood on that stage in a moment that the music press would later describe as a triumph, a resurrection, a reminder of what Marvin Gaye was capable of when he applied himself. But the framing of the story as a comeback implies that there was a conventional version of success that Marvin had fallen away from and returned to. What actually happened was different. Marvin hadn't returned to anything. He had done the only thing he knew how to do when the conventional path collapsed, which was to get quieter, go deeper, and trust the music to find its audience the same way it always had. Not through calculation, but through honesty. The drum machine hadn't been a compromise. It had been the only instrument available to a man with nothing left to prove and everything left to say. Larkin Arnold, to his credit, did not pretend the conference room had been unanimous in its enthusiasm. In interviews given years after sexual healing had secured its place in music history, he spoke about the moment with the particular candor of a man who has had enough time to find something instructive in being wrong. He acknowledged that the initial concerns about the production were genuine, that the drum machine had been a real point of discussion, that the label had not delivered Marvin an unqualified green light and simply stepped back. He said something that the people who had been in that conference room recognized as the most honest summary available, that the recording had taught him something about the difference between a song that sounds finished and a song that is finished, and that Marvin Gaye had understood that difference more completely than anyone in that room. It was a quiet admission offered without theater, but in it was everything. The architecture of a lesson that no production meeting can teach. The particular education that only arrives when a voice does something your metrics didn't prepare you for. The studio in Austin where Sexual Healing was recorded no longer exists. It was demolished years later, the building replaced by something with no memory of what had happened inside it. The drum machine that powered the track's opening pulse was a piece of consumer equipment, not a professional studio instrument. The kind of thing that session musicians of that era dismissed without a second thought. The synthesizer line was simple enough that a beginning keyboard player could reproduce it in an afternoon. Everything about the physical circumstances of that recording pointed toward a record that shouldn't have worked, a production that the conference rooms of the music industry were entirely correct to view with skepticism. And yet the song has outlasted every argument made against it. It has outlasted the conference room and the careers of most of the people who sat in it. It has outlasted Marvin himself, who died 18 months after his Grammy night, shot by his father in a house in Los Angeles, carrying every unhealed thing that Sexual Healing had briefly made the world believe he'd found a way past. The song remained. The drum machine pulse remained. And the voice, that specific, irreducible, unrepeatable voice, remained too, caught on a reel of magnetic tape that a man in a thin jacket had handed to a courier in a Belgian coastal town without a cover letter, without promotional materials, without anything except the quiet certainty that what was on that tape was enough.